Hello, it's Julio. I'm building a Kitbash library in Substance Designer. And that's going to save me a lot of time when I make something more complex because I can get these details and drop them in and include them on the new texture. But how do I bring them in? I have so many nodes right now and I don't want to bring the graph into a new substance. That's going to make things really complicated. So the solution that I want to share with you is this little tool that I just made. And if I select the tool, it has a couple of height map categories: circular, pills, dots, and large. So if we have a circular as an example, then we're going to be able to choose between the circular patterns that are included. And right now I have 3. And of course, in the future, I can add more. So let's go over the step-by-step process of creating a tool like this in Substance Designer. I hope you enjoy, and thank you for watching. So this is the scene that we're going to be working with. I have 10 height maps that are ready to be plugged in. The idea is that I can drop in this tool into any graph that I make in the future, and it's going to be easy for us to choose between the height maps. I don't want just one slider to choose between the 10 options. What if we have 20 or 30 one day? It's going to be really confusing. But what I want to do is instead make categories. And I want you to choose the categories that make sense for your height maps as well. Like for example, if I look at these 3, they have similarities. So this can be one category, like dots. And then once we choose the category from the drop-down menu, we can use a slider to choose between dots A, dots B, or dots C. And then after we make our selection and we see it on the model, we can just adjust a few settings like how blurry the height map is, if we want normal maps, and how intense the normal maps are going to be. So let's get started by adding the nodes that we need, and then we can adjust the settings. In order to create those sliding menus, let's add a multi-switch grayscale. And we're going to have to add one for each category, so we're going to be doing the one for the dots. And because we have 3 of these dot patterns, we can set the input selection to 3. So we're going to add one more. And this is going to be for the pills. And because there's only 2 of them, we're going to have to keep the input selection at 2. Now we're going to do one for the circular patterns. And then change it to 3. And then the last one is going to be for the larger patterns. And we can change that to 2. In order to create the drop-down menus or the slider menus, you actually use the same node in Substance Designer. So the one that we're using now, we're going to create one more. But this is going to be a drop-down menu, and we want to choose between the categories. So let's add another multi-switch grayscale, and this one we are setting it for 4. So it's going to be 1 for each category. Now that it's plugged in, I want to introduce the option to be able to invert this. So let's add an invert node. So let's add a switch grayscale. This is not going to be the multi-switch that we used earlier. This is a Boolean. So the pin on the top of this node is true and the pin on the bottom is false. So we want to plug in the invert grayscale at the top. So that way when we have the switch turned on for invert, it uses the one on the top. So let's move these to the right to clean things up a bit. And we want to do the same thing for the normal map, but in this case we're going to be using a switch color. And then we're going to be plugging in the normal to true. And false, I'm just going to leave it blank because the whole node is going to disappear when it's false. Now that we have all the nodes created, let's start off by creating the drop-down menu. And for that, we're going to go to the multi-switch grayscale. On the input selection, expose the new graph input. We're going to give it a simple name. The identifier is how we call it out in the backend, so we're just going to keep it simple and call it category. The label is what we see in the user interface, so we can describe it better. Height map category. And then for the group is where the menu item appears on the tool, so let's call it height. And from the type, we're going to be choosing drop down list. You notice that when you add a few items to the drop-down list, it starts with the number 0, but I want it to start with number 1. And right now I have 3, so I need to add 1 more. And then the numbers are in place, 1 through 4. And I want to label them in the order in which they're plugged in. So the dots are plugged into the first pin on that switch. The pill is the second, circular is third, and then the last one is large. And this is the way that we're going to be seeing the options on the menu. And now that it's done, I'm going to close this section. And I'm going to be working on the sliders for each of these groups. Let's start off with dots. It's pretty straightforward, so we're going to go to the input selection and then expose the new graph input. But instead of using the drop-down list, we're going to keep the slider for this. I think it's more intuitive when you're already chosen a category that you can just slide between the patterns. So identifier is going to be dots, label is going to be dot patterns. So that's going to be the user interface name. And then the category or the group is going to be height as well. And for this, we actually want to cap the max number that we can slide through to the number that we have. So in this case, it was 3. Let's do the same thing for the pills. And this is going to be just identified as pills, and then pill patterns as the label. The group is going to be height, and then the max number, because we only have 2 pills right now, is going to be 2. Actually, I'm putting it in the wrong place. So the max number needs to be 2, and then this is done. And now we do the same thing for the circular patterns. The input selection, we expose the new graph input, and then change the names on things. Circular patterns. And I'm seeing that we actually have 3 of these patterns, so the max needs to be 3. And yes, the group needs to be height as well. And then we have the last one, and expose. This one's large patterns. Height on the grouping. And then the max for this is going to be 2. The idea that once we create new height maps, we can always plug them in and increase the number that we see on these tools. And this way, when we drop in this tool, it's going to be exciting. It's going to be having more and more variety, more and more options. So in a different map, I'm going to be dropping in the tool. You do that by dragging in the graph from the menu on the left and dragging it into the scene. So I dragged in the trim sheets M25, and that's the tool. And yes, right now, if I select different categories, it changes the height map. That's a great sign. And then we can toggle the patterns. And it's inverted by default, so we need to fix that. But overall, what we've done so far is working. So let's take care of that. Let's do the switches. So in order to do that, we need to go to the switch grayscale and expose it. So I'm thinking what the identifier could be. We can just call it invert, and the label that we see in the UI is going to be invert height map. Actually, we don't need the description. It's pretty self-evident what it does. And by default, let's put false. So when I put the default as false, you can immediately see that it ignores the inverted height map. So the same thing for the normal map. We go to the switch color and expose that switch. And the identifier can be just normal. And this one can be use normal map. and the group is going to be normal. I forgot that the invert height map needed to have a group. In order to do that, we can just double click on the trim sheet 725 and we get the entire menu that allows us to see all the parameters that we just added. So we can open them and adjust the settings. In this case, I just changed the group of that invert switch. So next we can expose the parameters that we want to tweak. In this case, we can expose the normal intensity as one of them. And we don't want to use the identifier intensity because that can be used for other things as well. So for the label, it's going to be normal intensity, and same thing for the identifier, but I didn't add any spaces. And then the group is going to be a new group called normal. The default is already set to the value that I had previously, so that's going to be fine. We need to do the same thing for the blur HQ grayscale. So let's expose the intensity of it. And for the identifier, we can just add blur intensity. For the label, we want to be more descriptive. So let's add height blur intensity. And the group is going to be height. And the default settings are already set. So we have properly created our exposed parameters. So we're going to save all. And then we can open up the scene that has the tool dropped in so we can test out everything. The sliders are working. We have the blur intensity working as well. Here I'm seeing that the normal and normals are actually two separate groups. So whenever you create this tool on your own, just make sure that the group names are the same. So if you put height and heights, there's going to be two separate groups. In this case, I created normal and normals. But you can see here that everything is working. The switches, everything is fine. But the UI it needs some cleanup because right now everything shows up. So if I choose dots on the pattern, for example, you see all of the menus for pills, for the circular patterns, for the large patterns, and we don't want that. And I'm going to be dragging one of these menus to the top. I want these menus to be arranged in a very logical way that's easy to understand. In order to clean up the menus, we need to populate that section called visible if. If we hover over it, we see an example. I'm going to be pasting the command on the description of the video, but also on the screen. What we need to see is the identifier that we need to use. So in this case, it's category. And then the number corresponds to the specific menu item. So now for the dot patterns, we need to keep that in mind. So I'm going to be pasting a command to the visible if. And it already has the category there. But now I need to change the number to 1 because this is dots. Essentially, you're telling the program when you're selected, you're visible, and if you're not, you're invisible. So the number 2 needs to be pasted to height. So it's essentially the same command, but it has a different number at the end. And then we're looking at the circular patterns. That's going to be number 3. And then the large ones, number 4. If you remember, the drop-down menu is called category, and this is why we're using that name. We're going to do the same thing for the normal map. We don't want the normal intensity to show up if the normals are disabled. So for the normal intensity, we're calling out the normal group instead of category. That's the name that we gave to that Boolean on and off switch. In this case, we don't have numbers, we have a true or false. So we're gonna make sure that the visible condition is set to true. We can actually use the same visible conditions for outputs. So I'm gonna copy the one that we used for the menu and paste it on the normal output. So if the normal is switched to off, the output pin disappears on the tool. So now we can go to our test map and see the changes. Just trying to check the render settings, make sure everything's correct. I'm gonna check the default shader. Let's see if the tessellation scale is set correctly. So I need to increase the scale, that way we can see the displacement. Increase the tessellation factor. So yes, you can see the menu is very clean. When I select dots on the category, only the dots slider shows up. The normal map function works as well. I'm going to test it out and disconnect the pin. So when I set the normal to false, the pin should disappear, and when it's true, the pin should appear. This is a very good way when you're creating these kinds of tools to give functionality to the user. If you don't want all of the maps and outputs to display at the same time, you can start off with something simple and then it becomes complex as people turn things on and off. So right now I'm testing the height map categories and just make sure that everything's working. I plugged in the AO just so the display is better and more representative. Yes, you can see the circles are appearing properly. We have 3 of them. And then we're just going to test out the large patterns, and there's 2. The only minor fix I need to do is make sure that the group names are matching for the normal. But as you can see here, this is a very useful tool. I can use it in any graph. It's just one node that I drop in, and I can choose between all these height maps and add detail to my scenes. Thank you for watching. I hope that you found it useful. If you have any requests for future tutorials, any questions or comments, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you soon.